Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we uncover the most chilling and mysterious tales from around the world. Tonight, we're venturing deep into the haunted forests and swamps of Texas, a state known for its untamed wilderness and spine-chilling legends. From the whispers of Big Thicket to the menacing Goatman of Lake Worth, these 10 camping stories will take you on a journey into the heart of fear. Dim the lights, settle in, and prepare to explore the dark secrets of the Lone Star State. Story number 1. The Whispers in Big Thicket. You never forget the first time you realize you're not alone. Truly not alone. In a place where there should be no one else. I don't mean the comforting company of another human being. I mean something different. Something that doesn't belong. Something that sees you before you see it. That's the kind of realization that sticks with you, that changes you. It was a late October weekend when my friend Eric convinced me and his younger brother, Mike, to go camping in Big Thicket National Preserve. We weren't strangers to the outdoors. Eric and I grew up hiking in and around Texas. And Mike, despite being a city kid through and through, tagged along whenever we let him. It was supposed to be one of those easy trips. Pitch a tent, tell some stories, maybe drink a little too much beer around the fire. But Big Thicket isn't just any forest. It has a reputation, a long history of strange disappearances, unsettling sightings, and whispered legends passed down by locals. I'd heard them before, but like most people, I didn't put much stock in campfire tales. At least, not until that night. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun slanting low through the trees as we parked and hiked to a secluded spot off one of the less traveled trails. The preserve was massive, dense with towering pines and cypress trees, their gnarled roots snaking through thick underbrush. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay, like the forest was slowly swallowing itself. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. By the time we set up camp and built a fire, darkness had crept in, turning the woods into an ink-black maze. The flames cast flickering shadows that danced across the trees. And for a while, we just sat there, talking and laughing. The crackle of the fire, our only companion, felt safe, normal. But then, around midnight, the whispers started. First, I thought it was just the wind. The trees in Big Thicket are so close together that even a light breeze can sound like murmuring. But this wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like a voice just out of reach. I remember looking at Eric, expecting him to laugh it off, but he was staring into the trees, his face pale and tight. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Mike and I nodded. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft, lilting sound that seemed to circle us. It was almost soothing, in a way, but something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't words exactly, more like a melody made of breath and syllables, impossible to pin down. "Probably just the wind," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shaky. Eric stood up, grabbing his flashlight. "I'm gonna check it out." "Bad idea," I said, but he was already walking toward the tree line, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing. "Is someone out there?" The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was silence, deep, oppressive silence that seemed to press against my ears. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow, tall and slender, slipping between the trees. I froze, my heart hammering. It was too big to be an animal, too fluid to be a person. Eric must have seen it too, because he stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Eric, get back here," I shouted, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the night. He didn't move. His flashlight flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a face, pale and featureless, staring at him from the darkness. Then it was gone, and Eric was running back toward us, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "There's something out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What did you see?" Mike asked, his eyes wide. Eric shook his head. "I don't know. He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. It's watching us. Before we could say anything, the whispers started again, louder this time. They were coming from all around us, weaving through the trees like a living thing. I shined my flashlight into the woods, and that's when I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving between the trees, their shapes flickering like smoke. Some were tall and thin, others twisted and hunched, their movements unnatural, like marionettes on invisible strings. Every time the light touched them, they froze, then melted back into the darkness. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. But leaving wasn't that simple. The shadows didn't just watch, they followed. As we packed up camp in a panicked frenzy, the whispers grew louder, filling my head with a low, droning hum that made it hard to think. It wasn't just noise anymore, it was words. I couldn't understand them, but I felt them, like claws scratching at the edges of my mind. We stumbled back toward the trail, our flashlights casting jittery beams through the trees. The shadows moved with us, always just out of reach, their whispers never stopping. Once, I thought I felt a cold hand brush my neck, but when I turned, there was nothing there. By the time we reached the car, we were all shaking, too terrified to speak. We piled in, and Eric floored it, the tires spinning on the dirt before catching traction. As we sped down the narrow road, I looked back and saw them, dozens of shadowy figures standing at the edge of the forest, their faces hidden, their bodies unnaturally still. The whispers followed us home. For weeks after that night, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard them, soft and insistent, calling to me from the darkness. I started seeing things, shadows flickering in the corners of my vision, pale faces watching from windows that I knew should be empty. Mike stopped talking to us altogether, and Eric hasn't been the same. He won't tell me what he saw in the woods, but sometimes, late at night, I hear him muttering to himself, his voice trembling with fear. I don't know what's in Big Thicket, and I don't think I want to, but I do know one thing, it's still out there, waiting. And if you ever hear the whispers, do yourself a favor, don't listen. Story number 2. The Weeping Woman of Caddo Lake. They say Caddo Lake is beautiful, that it's a hidden gem of Texas, with its cypress trees draped in Spanish moss and its calm waters reflecting the sky. But when I think of Caddo Lake, beauty isn't the first thing that comes to mind. No, I think of the crying, of the figure in white, and of the night I came closer to something I still can't explain. It was late October when my friend David convinced me to join him for a weekend at the lake. He'd rented a cabin not far from the water, and he sold the trip as a peaceful getaway. "It'll be relaxing," he said. "No work, no stress, just fishing, a few beers, and maybe a ghost story or two." I should have known better than to agree. David had a reputation for his love of the macabre urban legends, haunted places, that sort of thing. But I figured a weekend away wouldn't hurt. Besides, how often do you get to stay on a lake like Caddo? The drive out there was uneventful, just miles of winding roads and thick woods. We arrived in the early evening, the sun dipping low over the horizon. The cabin was small but cozy, perched on a hill overlooking the water. From the porch, I could see the lake stretching out in all directions, the surface smooth and glassy, like a mirror. "You know the story, right?" David asked as we unloaded the car. "What story?" I replied, already regretting the question. He grinned, that mischievous look I knew too well. "The Weeping Woman. People say she drowned here a long time ago. Some say it was an accident. Others say it wasn't. Either way, she's still here. They hear her crying at night, see her walking along the shore in a white dress. And if you get too close," he let the sentence hang, like a punchline waiting to land. I rolled my eyes. "Let me guess. She disappears." David laughed. "Oh, she disappears. All right, but some say she takes you with her." I laughed it off, but the unease settled in anyway. There was something about the lake, its stillness, its depth that felt wrong. But I didn't say anything. I wasn't about to let David think he'd gotten to me. That first night, everything seemed normal. We grilled burgers on the porch, drank a couple of beers, and watched the stars come out. The lake was quiet. The only sounds the occasional splash of a fish or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. By the time we turned in, I'd almost forgotten David's story. But then I woke up. It was sometime after midnight. The cabin dark except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the windows. First, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a soft, mournful sound drifting up from the lake. Crying. I sat up, my heart pounding. The sound was faint, almost like it wasn't real, but it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced over at David, still snoring in his bed, oblivious. For a moment, I thought about waking him, but I didn't. Instead, I got up, grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The lake stretched out before me, its surface shimmering in the moonlight. The crying was clearer now, rising and falling like the tide. A sound so full of sorrow it made my chest ache. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped. I shined the flashlight toward the water, the beam cutting through the darkness. First, I didn't see anything, just trees and shadows, their reflections rippling across the surface. But then I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the lake, her figure pale and luminous in the moonlight. She wore a white dress, the fabric clinging to her as if it were wet, and her hair hung in dark, tangled strands. She was facing the water, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. "Hey!" I called, louder this time. "Are you okay?" She didn't move. I stepped off the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my weight, and started down the hill. The flashlight shook in my hand, the beam flickering as I moved closer. "Do you need help?" I called out. She turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, God, her eyes were black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck the light from the air. Her mouth hung open, a silent scream frozen in place, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare. Then she vanished. 1 second she was there, the next she was gone, like a wisp of smoke blown away by the wind. But the crying was back, louder now, echoing all around me. I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and landing in the dirt. The beam flickered, casting wild shadows across the trees. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. One moment I was by the lake. The next I was slamming the door shut behind me, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. David was awake now, staring at me with wide eyes. "What the hell happened?" he asked. "She's out there," I gasped. "The woman, the one you talked about." David didn't laugh. He didn't say a word. He just grabbed the flashlight and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. And then we heard it, the crying. It was closer now, rising and falling just outside the cabin, like she was circling us. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast I could see my breath fogging in the air. "We need to leave," David said, his voice tight. We grabbed our things in a frenzy, shoving them into bags without care or order. By the time we made it to the car, the crying had stopped, but the cold remained, clinging to us like a second skin. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lake, half expecting to see her standing there, watching us. But the shore was empty. That was 2 years ago. I haven't been back to Caddo Lake since, and I don't plan to. David and I don't talk about what happened, but I know he remembers. I can see it in his eyes, in the way he avoids dark water and the sound of crying. They say Caddo Lake is beautiful. Maybe it is, but some beauty hides darker things that linger long after they should be gone. And if you ever hear crying by the water, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. Story number 3. The Miner's Ghost of Davis Mountains. Let me start by saying I didn't believe in ghosts. Not until that night. The night I heard the hammering. The night I saw the light. And the night I realized some things refused to stay buried. It was late October when my brother Jack suggested a camping trip to the Davis Mountains. Jack had always been the outdoorsy one, dragging me along on his harebrained adventures since we were kids. I wasn't thrilled about spending my weekend in the middle of nowhere, but he insisted. The Davis Mountains are beautiful this time of year, he said, leaning on my desk at work. It'll be quiet, peaceful, just us, the stars, and a little hiking. I gave in, more out of guilt than enthusiasm. I hadn't seen much of Jack since he moved to El Paso, and I figured a weekend away might do us both some good. If only I'd known. We arrived at the trailhead just before sunset. The sky a brilliant blaze of orange and purple. The air was cool, crisp, with that clean smell you only get in the mountains. Jack had picked a campsite near an old mining area, a relic from the 19th century when the Davis Mountains were alive with the clang of pickaxes and the hiss of steam engines. He talked about the history of the place as we set up camp, his voice brimming with excitement. This whole area used to be a silver mine, he said, pointing toward a rocky outcrop. There's a bunch of old shafts and tunnels around here, but most of them are collapsed or sealed off. Great, I muttered, already regretting my decision. Just what I need, an impromptu caving trip. Jack laughed, clapping me on the back. Come on, it'll be fun. Besides, it's not like the miners are still hanging around. That night, I learned he was wrong. We built a fire and settled in, the flames casting dancing shadows across the trees. Jack told stories about the miners who worked these hills, how they spent weeks underground, digging for silver and copper. He mentioned the collapse of 1892, when part of the mine caved in, trapping dozens of men inside. They say some of them were buried alive, he said, his voice low, and that their spirits still haunt the mountains. Let me guess, I said, rolling my eyes. Campfire ghost story? He shrugged. You'd be surprised. A lot of campers say they've heard things out here hammering. Voices, even footsteps. Sure they have, I said, trying to sound unimpressed. But the truth was, the thought of spending the night near a graveyard of buried miners gave me the creeps. By the time we crawled into our sleeping bags, the fire had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily quiet. I lay there staring at the tent ceiling, listening to the rustling of the wind through the trees. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember is waking up to a sound. Tap, tap, tap. First, I thought it was just a branch knocking against something, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It sounded like metal striking rock, faint but steady, coming from somewhere in the distance. Jack, I whispered, nudging him. Do you hear that? He grumbled something and rolled over, clearly more interested in sleep than the strange noise. But I couldn't ignore it. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. The sound was louder now, echoing through the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the faint outline of the mountains beyond. But the sound didn't stop. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then I saw the light. It flickered through the trees, faint and golden, like the glow of an old lantern. My heart pounded as I followed it, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. The tapping grew louder with each step, the sound of a pickaxe striking stone, relentless and rhythmic. Hello, I called out, my voice trembling. Is someone there? No answer, just the tapping, steady as a heartbeat. The light led me to a clearing, where the ground sloped downward into a shallow depression. At the center was the entrance to an old mine shaft, its wooden beams rotted and splintered. The lantern light hung there, hovering like a will-o'-the-wisp, illuminating the dark mouth of the tunnel. That's when I saw him. A man stood in the clearing, his back to me. He was tall, his shoulders broad, and he wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. In one hand, He held a lantern. In the other, pickaxe. His clothes were old-fashioned, the kind you'd see in pictures of 19th century miners, torn and stained with dirt. "Hey!" I called, relief flooding me. "Are you lost?" He didn't answer. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the darkness of the mine. "Sir," I said, stepping closer. That's when he turned. I'll never forget his face. It wasn't a face at all, it was a skull, bleached white, with empty sockets that burned like coals. His jaw moved, and a sound came out, not words, but a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the air. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The lantern light flared, and the tapping grew deafening, a cacophony of hammers and picks striking rock. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight swinging wildly as I ran back toward camp, the sound chasing me through the trees. By the time I reached the tent, I was gasping for breath, my chest tight with panic. Jack was awake now, his face pale as I babbled about the miner, the light, the sound. "Slow down," he said, grabbing my shoulders. "What are you talking about?" Before I could answer, the sound returned. Tap, tap, tap. Closer this time. Jack grabbed his flashlight, and we both turned toward the trees. The lantern light was back, bobbing between the trunks, and I swear I saw the figure again, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. "Get in the car," Jack said, his voice low and urgent. We didn't bother packing up. We just grabbed the keys and ran, the sound of hammering echoing behind us as we tore down the dirt road. Even as we drove away, I could still see the light in the rearview mirror, fading into the distance. I haven't been back to the Davis Mountains since, and I don't plan to. Jack tries to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a trick of the light, maybe a prank by another camper. But I know better. I saw him, the miner, still working, still trapped, still searching for a way out. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the world is asleep, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. And I know he's still there. Story number 4. The Swamp Monster of Brazos Bend. I never imagined that a simple camping trip could change the way I see the world. Brazos Bend State Park, with its sprawling wetlands and lush greenery, seemed like the perfect getaway from the grind of everyday life. My girlfriend, Mia, and I had planned the trip for weeks, eager to experience the park's beauty and escape the city. What we didn't expect was to leave with a story we'd never be able to explain. The trip started uneventfully. We arrived at the park on a warm Friday afternoon, the sun casting golden light over the swampy landscape. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the occasional splash of an alligator breaking the water's surface reminded us that we were entering their domain. It was wild and beautiful, a place that felt alive in a way no city ever could. We set up camp near a small pond. Our tent nestled beneath a canopy of towering cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. The water was still and dark, reflecting the dense greenery around it like a mirror. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the swamp came alive with sound, the croaking of frogs, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic, but as night fell, the sounds changed. The lively hum of the swamp faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The air grew cooler, and an uneasy feeling settled over me, though I couldn't say why. It was around midnight when I first heard it. A deep, guttural growl, low and resonant, coming from somewhere beyond the pond. It was faint, but it cut through the stillness like a blade. "Mia," I whispered, nudging her awake. "Did you hear that?" She groaned, rubbing her eyes. "Hear what?" "Listen." We sat in silence, straining to hear. First, there was nothing. Then it came again, a growl, followed by the unmistakable sound of water splashing, as if something massive was moving through the swamp. "It's probably just an alligator," Mia said, though her voice was tinged with uncertainty. "They're all over this place." I nodded, trying to convince myself she was right. but the sound had been wrong. It wasn't the deep bellow of an alligator. It was something else, something I couldn't place. We tried to go back to sleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch, sent my heart racing. I finally drifted off sometime after 2 a.m., only to be jolted awake by a loud splash. This time, it was close, too close. The next morning, Mia brushed off my concerns. "It's a swamp," she said, packing her bag for a hike. "It's full of animals. Weird noises are part of the package." She had a point. I decided to let it go, chalking up the strange sounds to an overactive imagination. We spent the day exploring the park, hiking the trails and marveling at the diverse wildlife. Alligators basked lazily on the banks, their dark eyes watching us with detached indifference. Herons waded through the shallows, their long legs slicing through the water with precision. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the swamp. Mia was in high spirits, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The stillness from the night before had returned, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. That night, the growling came back. It started just after we'd settled into the tent, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the ground. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Mia," I whispered, shaking her awake. "It's back," she groaned. "What is?" "Listen." The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of water splashing, like something massive was moving through the swamp. This time, Mia sat up, her expression shifting from annoyance to fear. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool night air. The beam of light swept across the campsite, illuminating the trees and the still surface of the pond. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I saw it. A shadow moved through the water, massive and lumbering, its shape distorted by the ripples. It was hunched, its broad back covered in what looked like scales that glistened in the moonlight. His head rose above the water, long and angular, with glowing yellow eyes that locked onto me. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The creature let out a deep, guttural growl, its massive jaws parting to reveal rows of jagged teeth. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, part reptile, part human, a grotesque amalgamation of both. "Mia," I whispered, my voice shaking, "get out of the tent." Slowly, she crawled out, her eyes widening as she saw the creature. "Oh my God," she whispered. The creature growled again, taking a step toward us. Its movements were slow but deliberate, water cascading off its massive body. I backed away, pulling Mia with me. "We need to run," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We turned and bolted toward the trail, the sound of splashing water and guttural growls chasing us through the darkness. The swamp seemed alive, the trees twisting and looming like sentinels watching our escape. Every step felt like it brought the creature closer, its heavy footsteps and wet snarls echoing in the stillness. We didn't stop until we reached the parking lot, our lungs burning and our legs trembling. The swamp behind us was silent once more, the creature nowhere to be seen. We threw our gear into the car and sped away, the eerie quiet of the park lingering in my mind. I've tried to make sense of what we saw that night. First, I thought it might have been an alligator, distorted by the moonlight and my fear. But alligators don't stand on two legs. They don't have glowing yellow eyes, and they sure as hell don't chase people out of the swamp. Since that night, I've read about Brazos Bend and the stories people tell, whispers of a swamp monster, a creature that defies explanation. Some say it's an ancient being, a relic from a time before humans. Others think it's a warning, a guardian of the swamp, protecting its domain from intruders. Whatever it is, I know one thing: I'll never go back to Brazos Bend. If you ever visit and hear the sound of water splashing or a low growl in the night, don't investigate. Don't wait to see what it is, because some things are better left unseen. Story number 5. The Knocking in the Brazos Mountains. I never thought the wilderness could feel so suffocating. When my girlfriend, Emily, and I planned a trip to Big Bend National Park, we envisioned solitude, breathtaking views, and nights under a canopy of stars. The Brazos Mountains, with their rugged peaks and isolated beauty, seemed like the perfect escape from the noise of daily life. What we didn't plan for was the knocking. We arrived at the park in late October, just as the weather was beginning to cool. The drive into the Brazos Basin was surreal, the towering cliffs and winding roads making it feel like we'd left the world behind. Our campsite was nestled among the trees, offering a stunning view of the mountains. It was exactly what we'd hoped for: secluded, serene, and utterly still. After setting up camp, we spent the afternoon hiking the trails, marveling at the vast desert stretching beyond the mountains. The silence of the park was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the comforting quiet of a forest filled with rustling leaves and birdsong. It was oppressive, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow every sound. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert came alive with shadows. The wind whispered through the trees, and the faint rustle of unseen creatures added a layer of unease. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and tried to shake the eerie feeling that had settled over us. "This place is incredible," Emily said, though her voice sounded hollow. She stared into the flames, her brow furrowed. "But it feels heavy." I nodded. I felt it too, an inexplicable weight that pressed down on me as the night grew darker. Started around midnight. We were lying in the tent, the fire reduced to glowing embers, when I heard the first knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably deliberate, a soft tap, tap, tap on the side of the tent. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, sitting up. Emily stirred beside me, groggy. "What?" "Listen." We held our breath, and the sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. It was rhythmic, almost polite, like someone knocking on a door. "Probably the wind," she mumbled, pulling the sleeping bag over her head. But I wasn't so sure. The night was still, the air heavy with an unnatural quiet. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cool desert air sending a shiver down my spine. The campsite was empty, the trees cast long, skeletal shadows, and the faint glow of the fire illuminated nothing but rocks and dirt. There was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made the sound. I stood there for a moment, listening. The silence was deafening, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I crawled back into the tent, my heart pounding. "Nothing there," I said, though my voice trembled. Emily didn't respond, already drifting back to sleep. I lay awake for hours, listening, but the knocking didn't return. The next morning, I brushed it off as my imagination. We spent the day exploring the park, hiking to the window trail and taking in the breathtaking views of the desert below. The beauty of the Brazos Mountains was undeniable, but that feeling of unease never left me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following us. By the time we returned to the campsite, the sun was sinking low in the sky, casting the mountains in an eerie orange glow. We built another fire, cooked dinner, and tried to enjoy the last night of our trip. "I read something about this place," Emily said as she stared into the flames. "Apparently, people have reported hearing strange noises out here." "What kind of noises?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Knocking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, like someone tapping on their tent or the trees. "Some people think it's the spirits of people who died here." "Spirits?" I scoffed, trying to hide the unease creeping up my spine. "Come on, you don't believe that, do you?" She shrugged. "I don't know, but this place feels off." That night, the knocking returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to come from all around the tent, moving from one side to the other. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. stepping out into the cold night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "Hello," I called, shining the flashlight around. The beam caught nothing but empty forest. I took a step forward, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots the only sound. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, followed by another knock. It was coming from a tree just beyond the campsite. I approached slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The tree was massive, its bark gnarled and ancient. I circled it, shining the light up and down, but there was nothing there. Then I felt it, a sudden, icy breath against the back of my neck. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. But there was no one there. The knocking had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on me. I backed away, nearly tripping over a rock, and bolted back to the tent. "We're leaving," I said, shaking Emily awake. "What? Why?" she mumbled. "I don't care. We're leaving now." We packed up in record time, throwing our gear into the car and speeding down the winding road that led out of the park. The knocking didn't follow us, but the feeling of being watched lingered. When we reached the safety of the highway, I finally exhaled, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. "I don't know what that was," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it wasn't human. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about the knocking. I started researching the Brazos Mountains and found countless stories like ours. Campers hearing taps on their tents, feeling unseen eyes watching them, experiencing an oppressive weight that defied explanation. Some believed it was the spirits of those who had died in the area. Others thought it was something older, tied to the land itself. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I know one thing. I'll never go back to the Brazos Mountains. If you ever find yourself camping there and hear a knock in the night, don't answer it. Don't step outside, because whatever's out there is waiting for you. Story number 6. The Goatman of Lake Worth. There are things in this world that don't want to be understood. You might stumble across them in the dark, catch a glimpse of something wrong, something unnatural, and for a moment, you'll wonder if your mind is playing tricks on you. But deep down, you'll know it's real. The Goatman is one of those things. It's been years since that night at Lake Worth, but I still can't sleep without a light on. Even now, the sound of heavy footsteps makes my heart race, and the sight of red eyes on a billboard, in a movie, anywhere, sends me into a cold sweat. I'm not crazy. I know what I saw, and if you listen, maybe you'll believe me too. It was late summer, one of those sticky Texas nights when the air feels like it's pressing down on you, and the smell of the lake hangs heavy everywhere. My buddy Brian had just gotten his old Jeep running again, and he decided we should take it out for a spin. He brought his girlfriend, Lisa, and her friend Claire, and since I had nothing better to do, I tagged along. "Let's go to Lake Worth," Brian said as we piled into the Jeep. "There's that old camping spot by the woods. We'll build a fire, have a couple of beers." I wasn't thrilled about spending the night in the middle of nowhere, but Brian could be convincing, especially when Lisa backed him up. So off we went, bouncing down the dirt roads, the headlights carving through the thick blackness of the countryside. The air was alive with the sound of crickets and cicadas, and for a while, it was easy to forget about the stories. You see, Lake Worth isn't just a pretty patch of water. It's known for the Goatman, a half-human, half-goat creature that supposedly roams the woods. People say it's huge, covered in matted fur, with glowing red eyes and a growl that'll freeze your blood. I'd heard the tales growing up, but like most local legends, I figured it was just something parents made up to keep kids from wandering too far into the forest. We found a spot near the edge of the woods, close enough to the lake that we could hear the water lapping against the shore. Brian got the fire going while Lisa and Claire spread out blankets. It was a perfect setup, the fire crackling, the stars shining overhead, the lake stretching out like a sheet of glass. But even then, something felt Off. The woods were too quiet. No rustling, no chirping, just a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to creep closer the longer we sat there. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the fire and the stories Brian was telling. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the darkness was watching us, waiting, and then we heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground. We all froze, our laughter dying in our throats. The sound came again, louder this time, and closer. It wasn't a dog, or a coyote, or anything I'd ever heard before. It was something else, something big. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "Probably just an animal," Brian said, though he didn't sound convinced. Lisa clung to his arm. "Maybe we should leave." "We're fine," Brian said, trying to sound tough. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. As we sat there, straining to hear, the growl turned into footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. They were coming from the woods, heading straight for us. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and pointed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I could see were shadows. And then, I stepped out. First, I thought it was a deer. It was tall, with long, muscular legs that ended in hooves. But as the light hit it, I realized it was standing upright, like a man. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its arms hung low, ending in long, clawed fingers. But the worst part was its face, half human, half something else, with twisted horns curling from its skull and glowing red eyes that seemed to burn into my soul. "What the hell is that?" Brian said, his voice shaking. The creature tilted its head, like it was studying us. Then it opened its mouth and let out a roar, a deep, bone-rattling sound that sent Lisa and Claire screaming. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, staring into those eyes, unable to look away. "Get in the Jeep," Brian shouted, grabbing Lisa and pulling her toward the car. The spell broke, and I scrambled to my feet. Dragging Claire with me, we piled into the Jeep, slamming the doors just as the creature lunged forward. His claws raked against the side of the car, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Brian started the engine, the tires spinning in the dirt before catching traction. We sped down the road, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but I could still see it in the rearview mirror, running after us on those massive legs. Kept pace with us for a terrifying few seconds, its red eyes glowing in the dark. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it veered off into the woods and disappeared. We didn't stop until we were back in town, the Jeep rattling like it might fall apart. No one said a word. When we finally pulled into Brian's driveway, we all just sat there, shaking, too scared to even look at each other. The next day, Brian found deep claw marks down the side of his Jeep, proof that it wasn't just a bad dream. We tried to tell ourselves it was just some kind of animal, a bear or a really big dog, but we knew better. There was no mistaking what we saw. It was real. I haven't been back to Lake Worth since that night, and I don't plan to. Whatever's out there is not something you can explain or reason with. It's ancient, primal, something that doesn't belong in our world. And if you ever find yourself near those woods, and you hear footsteps or a low growl in the dark, don't wait to find out what it is. Run. Story number 7. The Shadow Man of Guadalupe Mountains. I never thought the woods could make me feel small, not just physically, but spiritually. When you're out there, under a canopy of stars and surrounded by ancient, towering trees, you realize how insignificant you are, how fragile. That's the feeling I remember most from that night in the Guadalupe Mountains, fragility. That, and the Shadow Man. It was mid-November when my girlfriend, Emma, and I decided to take a weekend camping trip. We both loved the outdoors, and the Guadalupe Mountains National Park seemed like the perfect getaway, remote, beautiful, and far enough from the city to leave the world behind. We packed light, just the essentials, a tent, some food, flashlights, and my old camping knife. Looking back, I realized how unprepared we were, but at the time, felt like an adventure. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low over the rugged peaks. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and juniper. Emma was giddy, snapping pictures of the landscape and talking about the stars we'd see that night. I remember smiling, caught up in her excitement, completely unaware of what lay ahead. We set up camp in a secluded spot near the edge of the forest, not far from a narrow trail that wound deeper into the trees. By the time the tent was up and the fire was crackling, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was perfect, or at least, it should have been. The first sign that something was off came just after dark. We were sitting by the fire, eating canned chili and watching the flames dance, when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The usual sounds of the forest, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Even the wind had stopped. "Do you hear that?" I asked, breaking the silence. Emma looked up from her bowl. "Hear what?" "Exactly," I said. "It's too quiet." She frowned, glancing toward the trees. "Maybe the animals are asleep." "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. It wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath. We tried to shake it off, focusing on the warmth of the fire and the stars that were beginning to appear overhead. But the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. And then we heard it. A branch snapped somewhere in the woods, sharp and sudden. Emma froze, her eyes wide. "What was that?" "Probably just an animal," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trunks and shadows. Another snap, closer this time. My grip tightened on the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of leaves crunching, slow and deliberate, like footsteps. Emma grabbed my arm. "Let's go in the tent," she whispered. We hurried inside, zipping the flap shut behind us. I turned off the flashlight, plunging us into darkness, and we sat there, listening. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed against the thin walls of the tent. I could feel Emma's hand gripping mine, cold and shaking. For a moment, I thought it was over. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, and that it had wandered off. But then I felt it. The air changed, growing colder, sharper. A chill seeped through the tent, biting at my skin and making my breath fog. Emma whimpered, her grip tightening. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. And then I saw it. A shadow moved across the fabric of the tent, tall and impossibly thin. Stopped just outside, looming over us like a specter. My heart felt like it might burst as I stared at the outline, unable to look away. Emma was trembling, her breath hitching with every shallow inhale. "Who's there?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, as if watching us. I fumbled for the flashlight, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. When I finally managed to turn it on, I aimed the beam at the tent wall. The shadow was gone, but the cold remained, seeping into my bones and filling the air with a heavy, suffocating weight. I unzipped the tent just enough to shine the flashlight outside, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, just the dark, empty forest. Emma wanted to leave right then, but I convinced her to stay. It was late, and the idea of navigating the narrow, winding trail in the dark was too dangerous. "We'll leave at first light," promised, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, the flashlight clutched in my hand like a lifeline. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees sent my heart racing, but the shadow didn't return. By the time dawn broke, we were both exhausted, our nerves frayed to the breaking point. We packed up in silence, eager to put as much distance as possible between us and the forest. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure following us. But the woods remained empty. It wasn't until we reached the car that I noticed it. The frost. The windows were coated in a thin layer of ice, something that shouldn't have been possible in the mild November weather. Emma stared at it, her face pale, but neither of us said a word. We drove away, leaving the Guadalupe Mountains behind, but the memory of that night has stayed with me. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just my imagination or a trick of the light. But deep down, I know better. There's something in those woods, something that watches and waits. And if you're ever out there, camping under the stars, and you feel that chill creeping through the air, do yourself a favor. Don't look outside. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through Texas's haunted forests and swamps. From the eerie lights of Piney Woods to the ghostly drums of lost maples, these tales remind us that even in the vast wilderness, the unknown is never far away. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dive into the mysteries of the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, some shadows in the woods are more than just shadows.